Hello! This is Affinity Designer and I'm gonna draw some vector characters. Let's just start by pretending this is for a mobile app. The canvas is a 1080 by 1920 resolution with 72 dpi. I saved this as a preset already for posterity. Artboards are enabled, but if you forget this step, you can always enable it with the artboard tool. For this video, I'm gonna make some simple, cutesy characters based on another sketchbook page. Surprise! This is another sketch-to-digital video! Now I drew these characters with Affinity Designer in mind. The heads and bodies can be made with simple shapes, then these assets could be mixed and matched into different character designs. It'll be a good chance to demonstrate the symbols panel and the assets panel later when I'm done. I'm gonna use the shape tools to build these characters and avoid the pen tool if I can help it. No promises on that. So this cat starts with a primitive ellipse. Remove the fill lines, I just want to see the basic shapes. Whenever you lay out any shape, it's in a primitive state that won't let you edit the nodes individually. On the toolbar up here, there are options to convert to donut, convert to pie, but what I need is to convert to curves to gain access to the nodes, letting me mold the ellipse however I want. The chin looked weird, so I alt-click on the node to remove the current bezier, then remade the bezier handles, holding shift and dragging it to match the sketch. This started as an ellipse, now it's more customized but still symmetrical. Cat ears are usually triangular, so there's no other tool for it than the triangle tool. I added another point though so I can curve it to one side, holding shift again to pull out the bezier handles. I rounded the tip out with the corner tool to make it a bit friendlier. The fluffy cheeks look like clouds, and wouldn't you know it, Designer has a cloud tool. It was too much fluff, but I can reduce the bubbles. 7 bubbles should do. And with some manual adjustments, I got rid of that perfect shape. To mirror these features, I turned on snapping, then Alt-Shift drag to duplicate the shapes while keeping them aligned. Flip that horizontal. To be really sure that they're centered, I group these facial features together. Under alignment options, I went with align horizontally to selection bounds. This is the crescent tool for the cat's eyes. The default settings look like a crescent moon, but I adjusted that by dragging those red dots to modify the curves. There's a limit to those values, so I converted to curves to manually get the upper eyelid right. Think I'll use a triangle for this nose? Nah, I used an ellipse tool because I wanted those curves to be pre-built. These shapes will share one black color. I can combine them in a non-destructive way by hitting Alt-click on the Add Geometry button up here. And by non-destructive, it creates this compound layer. If I select that, the cheeks, ears, and head are recognized as one shape. But if I expand the compound layer on the Layers panel, it lists the original shapes of the head. I'll be doing the coloring later. It would be easier to color once all the assets are outlined. This raccoon head was made with the segment tool, which is like an ellipse tool that can be sliced up from 2 sides. At 0% on the lower line, it's a whole ellipse, but I want it to be at 50%. Most of the head features are made from this shape. Alt-drag to duplicate, then I adjusted to match the sketch. Not sure if I mentioned this before, but to symmetrically scale objects, hold Ctrl then drag to scale. Other programs have different modifier keys for that. In Affinity, it's Ctrl. These eye rings plus the snout will be clipped to the head by going to the Layers panel and nesting their layers under the raccoon head layer. The segment tool on the bird doesn't quite fit. The slice couldn't reach how low I sketched the chin. The proper tool here would be the Tear tool. Flip that upside down, and now the top portion matches the roundness while the bottom taper curves the way I wanted. The excess can be lopped off by creating a negative shape with a rectangle and triangles. I turned snapping on to place these triangles from end to end. Combine these into one big negative shape to be subtracted from the positive, which is the tear. The beak is obviously a diamond, but I'm not gonna keep it simple. I can't use the tear tool for that stray feather because these red dots only move inwards, not outwards, preventing droopy curves. Welp, I'm resorting to the pen tool. Crank that brush width up, and on the pressure graph, I moved one side down and gave it a gentle curve. Once the thickness was right, I went to the layer menu and chose Expand Stroke to convert that stroke into a shape. At this point, I had a lot of unnamed assets confusing me. The way I organized this is by creating a layer for each head asset. My naming convention is asset type _ character name 01. Asset type here is head, character name is cat or raccoon, and the 01 is the version number, assuming this will be animated. And I always assume that I'll be animating my art. Naming conventions change depending on the project, but those two ending digits are consistent. Last among the head assets, the rabbit head. It's mostly made of ellipses, but always modified. Don't take the shape tools at face value. Play with the primitive settings, then convert the curves to add imperfections. Modifying these simple shapes, even a few nudges to the nodes would put them a step above predictable. Like how the snout uses crescents in a couple of ways. I softened the nose crescent with the corner tool, then pinched the node underneath by removing the bezier. Again, that's done with Alt-click. The next two crescents look like a tiny mustache. A tiny gentleman mustache. A thin trapezoid would connect them to the nose. Then the corner tool smoothened out that inner angle. My collection of disembodied heads is complete. On to the bodies. Since they have a similar pose, I modeled the body template first. The torso starts with a trapezoid tool instead of a rectangle tool because I want the shoulders to be narrower than the hips. The trapezoid shows these red lines whenever I modify the left or right point. It lets me keep track of the width on this upper line. With the corner tool, I selected all the nodes to round them off. Doing this removes the trapezoid options, so use the corner tool on primitives if you're sure you don't need the settings anymore. But I can edit this manually anyway. I drew the noodle limbs with the pen tool, gave it a round cap, then thickened that up. If I want to add imperfections, that's the pressure graph again to taper the limbs from the shoulders and the hips. These limbs will be clipping masks, so they'll have to be expanded. Again, from the layer menu, Expand Stroke. As curves, these limbs can become clipping masks. I collected those body parts into a layer called body _ template 01. And I haven't explained this before, but I'm using layers instead of groups. If I put these body parts into a group instead of a layer, I'd have to double click on it to select one of the assets because a single click selects the whole group. However, double clicking might get tedious if you find yourself still editing an asset over and over again. So hit Ctrl-Shift-G to ungroup. On the other hand, when using a layer, a single click still lets you select an asset, but it might get tedious to select or box select the assets on the canvas. A way around that is to select the layer on the layers panel to edit it like a group. So layers and groups could practically work the same, at least for me. But in general, I prefer layers if I simply need to organize hierarchy, then groups if I want to minimize selecting multiple assets. Here's another trick with lines. To quickly curve a line, I can hover over this segment with the node tool and pull it. What it did was add a bezier handle to each of the nodes that make the segment. I had a roundabout method for this hemline. I made a heptagon with the polygon tool, that's a 7-sided polygon. With the corner tool, I selected these two nodes and switched the corner type into a concave curve up here. If I don't click Bake Appearance, then the corners would still be affected by a fixed percentage value. They're not keeping the same shape if I scale them like this. So baking the appearance is practically converting those corners into curves. Duplicating this weird shape completes the negative for the hemline. The druid costume looks unusual, but still possible with simple shapes. The cape is made of 3 shapes on top of each other. For the tunic, I saw an upside-down pentagon. I needed to narrow those 2 points in the middle, so converting this shape into a curve, I selected the nodes and turned on this transform mode. It isolates the selected nodes into a transform box. It looks like a line right now because the transform box is squished, but I can still scale it sideways and symmetrically. I rounded them off and moved them down to match the sketch. I was less rigid with the fringe. It's made of trapezoids ranging from thick to thin, big, medium, small again. That inner shape is a duplicate of the tunic shape, but with the contour tool, I pulled it inwards for even spacing. The ruffles on this dress also required some out-of-the-box thinking. That's a cloud intersected with an ellipse. Intersect is another geometry button among the add and subtract buttons. Experiment with the geometry buttons as well to get new shapes. This is a good number of assets to demonstrate how I'm gonna color them. I go to the Swatches panel and access the burger menu. There are a couple of options for palette types: application palette and document palette. I went with an application palette, which is a palette that's accessible across other documents, while a document palette would be exclusive to this document. Hit Add Current Fill to Palette, which would take from either the stroke or the fill, whichever you selected from those two. Right-click on the swatch it created for options like renaming. I built the rest of my palette based on my sketch, which was colored with earthy tones from a cheap set of markers. The colors might look dull on a monitor, so upon color picking, I shifted them towards a bit more saturation on the color wheel. I developed the style a little more by drawing some line-based textures. These were drawn with Artifacts Forge's fine liner brushes, which is a premium brush set. At some point deep into this process, I realized that beginners wouldn't have brushes like these. That's when I decided I should make a tutorial about custom vector brushes, which should be posted before this video. Consider that as required viewing, but the example brushes I made are free to download. I'll link them in the description. My realization came too late for me to roll back and apply my brushes on these characters. But I hope you find my set workable, or maybe my tutorial could give you an idea on how to make your own custom set. I believe in you! Don't forget to turn Scale Object on to avoid weird stretching on the brushes. This will let the brush width scale itself and keep to your intended proportions. The accessories are a much simpler category of assets. The ribbon is just a couple of hearts tied by an ellipse. The bowler hat is a couple of segment shapes facing opposite directions. I resorted to the brush tool for the antlers. I could use the built-in star tool for the wand, but why not make it complicated with triangles? That's two triangles pointing in opposite directions. Then I subtracted a third triangle underneath it to get this really wonky star. I tried. So back to the actual star. I gave it some chunk by adjusting the inner radius and turning on the curved edges options. The luggage could be made with straightforward rectangles, but rectangles are boring. Trapezoids are supreme. To give rectangles a chance to redeem themselves, round off the bottom nodes until they look like half circles, and that gives them drip, for the green drip on the bucket. I wanted the candle to have a flat, solid glow. The dots from this stipple brush look like particles if they're enclosing a circle. Again, if you don't have this premium brush set, my free set comes with a stipple brush for you to try this effect yourself. The liquid in this glass is pretty irregular, so I had to make a custom shape with the pen tool to subtract from this green circle. The chain on this pocket watch is made of dotted beads. For dotted shapes like this, I switched the line style from solid to dashes. The cap style should be rounded, and then to get the circular lengths, edit the dash values down here. The first box is the value for the dash length, the second is the dash spacing. Usually a length of 0.25 gets me those bead-like shapes. Spacing value can vary, 1.25 did it for this chain. The third and fourth dash values are for alternating length and spacing, but they can be left blank if unnecessary. There are some complicated parts on the musical instruments, but they were achievable by combining a pair of shapes. The banjo's head, I'm not familiar with instruments, is a couple of hearts. I rounded the inner corners to make the angle smoother, while the guitar is a couple of tear shapes. then corner tool again on the inner corners. So that's all the props and characters. They're gonna need a background to properly greet you. I blew up this thumbnail for the mockup board, and I have another sketch for the background assets. These are much simpler than characters and props, so I'm gonna skip explaining how I made each one. What I'll explain next is the difference between Affinity's concepts of symbols and assets. They're both libraries that make it convenient to reuse objects. One difference is similar to the difference between document and application palettes. A symbol library is exclusive to this document, while an asset library is cross-document. For this project, I converted the environment assets into symbols by selecting one asset and hitting the Create button on the panel. Groups, curves, and compound shapes can be symbols, but for some reason, not layers. The advantage of symbols is that if you edit one, the changes are shared among other symbols in real time. You can tell that they're symbols if they have this orange line on the Layers panel. If you don't want changes to share on a specific symbol, hit the Detach button. The selected symbol turns into a normal layer, and it won't receive changes from the other symbols anymore. Even among linked symbols, there are some changes that they can't share, such as scaling and rotating. That means you can have variations of sizes and angles on similar symbols. I built the background by dropping the environment symbols onto the canvas, starting with the elements at the back. With all my elements laid out, most of my color choices were blending into each other. I fixed that with hue adjustment layers, which can be created via this button down here. HSL means hue, saturation, and luminosity. If I'm unsure of the overall values, I create a desaturation layer, which is an HSL layer with desaturation at 0%. This lets me determine if the foreground is mixing with the background too much. After some hue sat shifts, this was how my background had looked so far. Attaching adjustment layers to symbols is an edit that's shared with others, so if you don't want that to happen, remember to detach them. For the characters and props, I saved them into an asset library instead. Under the Assets panel, Menu button, hit Create New Category for this blank library, which I renamed into Cute Characters. Remember when I said you can't create symbols from layers? Well, you can create assets from layers. I selected one from the Layers panel, then under this secondary menu button, not the button on the top, choose Add from Selection. The Rename button is for renaming this subcategory. I created another subcategory to separate the different asset types. I have heads, bodies, and props, so the Assets panel can be more organized than the Symbols panel and my closet. I also forgot during the recording, but you can drag objects into the panel to quickly add them as assets. Like the symbols, I can drag them back onto the canvas. This step shows my flawed color choices again. That's another round of adjustment layers. On duplicates of the main artboard, I can drag out other assets to create new characters, new friends. Since I didn't really balance the colors on them, I added standalone adjustment layers or detached some symbols to manually shift their colors. As assets, any change I make to one won't affect other copies. Still, the advantage of assets is that they can be shared across documents. These characters can't be restricted to this one. They're free to go on an evening stroll, or have sleepovers, or host a family barbecue. Hope you found this tutorial helpful. Give a like and comment if you did, and subscribe for more art videos. We'd all be happy if you could join us. Bye!